Solve this and you'll get 3 million, he laughed. But I, the maid, made the millionaire eat his words. It started as a joke, but the sting behind his smirk was sharper than any insult I had endured in my 15 years as a live-in maid. The man who owned the sprawling Manhattan penthouse I cleaned looked down at me, his sneer barely masked by a glass of expensive scotch. Maybe you're working for someone who never says thank you or cleaning up while everyone else sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. My name is Maria Elena Santos, and I've been cleaning other people's messes since I was 17 years old. I'm 53 now, and my hands tell the story better than my words ever could. The calluses from scrubbing marble floors. The permanent indent on my ring finger where a thin gold band once sat before my husband left me for a younger woman who didn't smell like bleach and floor wax at the end of each day. This January morning in New York City, I wore my usual uniform, a navy blue dress that had seen better years, sensible black shoes with worn soles, and an apron that no amount of washing could make truly white again. The chill seeped through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, 43 floors above the chaos of Manhattan. Central Park stretched below like a green carpet dusted with snow, while inside, the scent of imported jasmine candles mixed with the metallic gleam of crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people make in a year. But let me tell you about the man who owned this palace in the sky. Richard Pemberton III. His family's wealth came from old money, railroad investments, oil stocks, and more recently, a fortune built on cryptocurrency and Bitcoin trading. The man had assets worth hundreds of millions, with investment portfolios that included everything from Manhattan real estate to tech startups in Silicon Valley. His net worth was the kind that appeared in Forbes magazine, the kind that bought senators and built hospital wings just for the tax write-offs. That morning, as I dusted the mahogany bookshelves filled with leather-bound classics he'd never read, I heard him on the phone with his broker. "Move another 50,000 into those Tesla stocks," he barked, "and check on the Bitcoin prices. My cryptocurrency advisor says we could see another surge." Money flowed through his fingers like water, while I stretched every dollar I earned just to send something home to my daughter in the Bronx. Richard loved to play games with people, especially people like me, those he considered beneath his notice. He'd throw out challenges, riddles, puzzles, just to watch us struggle and fail. It amused him, this display of intellectual superiority. His friends would gather in the marble-floored living room, their laughter echoing off walls decorated with art worth more than entire city blocks, while I moved around them like furniture, invisible, silent, convenient. The riddle came during one of his dinner parties. 20 guests sat around a dining table that could seat a small army, plates of gold-rimmed china reflecting the light from chandeliers overhead. I was serving the third course, some fancy French dish with a name I couldn't pronounce, when Richard's voice cut through the dinner conversation. "I have a challenge," he announced, his words slightly slurred from the expensive wine. "A little brain teaser for our entertainment." His eyes swept the room before landing on me, standing quietly by the kitchen door with an empty serving tray. "Maria," he called out, and every head turned in my direction. "Come here." My heart sank. I knew that tone. I'd heard it before when he wanted to make someone the center of attention, not the good kind of attention, but the kind that made you wish you could disappear into the polished marble floor. "Yes, sir," I said quietly, approaching the table with careful steps. "I have a puzzle for you," he said, his smile sharp as broken glass. "An old riddle that's been stumping people for centuries. If you can solve it, and I mean really solve it, not just guess, I'll give you $3 million. He paused for effect, letting the number hang in the air like expensive perfume. "Cash, no taxes, clean money, all yours." The room fell silent except for the gentle clink of silverware against china. $3 million, More money than I could earn in 6 lifetimes of scrubbing floors and washing dishes. More money than existed in my entire world. But, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout, when you can't solve it, and you won't be able to, you'll admit in front of everyone here that you're exactly what you appear to be. A simple woman with a simple mind, content to clean up after her betters. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. Every face at that table was turned toward me, some curious, others embarrassed by their host's cruelty, but none brave enough to speak up. These were people who lived in the same rarefied air as Richard, hedge fund managers, real estate moguls, socialites whose husbands held portfolios worth 8 figures. They might whisper about his behavior later, but they'd never risk their social standing by defending the help. "Do you accept the challenge, Maria?" Richard asked, his voice carrying the mock courtesy of someone who already knew the outcome. I should have said no. I should have excused myself, gone back to the kitchen, finished serving dessert with quiet dignity. But something in his tone, something in the way his eyes gleamed with anticipated triumph, made me nod. "I accept, sir." The riddle he gave me was old, complex, involving logic and wordplay that twisted back on itself like a snake eating its own tail. As he spoke the words, I saw the satisfied smirks appear on faces around the table. This wasn't just entertainment for them. It was confirmation of their superiority, proof that the natural order of things placed them at mahogany tables while people like me served their food. But here's what Richard Pemberton III didn't know about me. Here's what none of them knew. Before my husband left, before financial desperation drove me into domestic work, I had been 2 semesters away from a mathematics degree at Hunter College. I'd been studying logic, working with probability theory, dreaming of becoming a teacher. Those dreams died when the bills piled up and my daughter needed food more than I needed education. But the mind that had once solved complex equations didn't disappear just because I started carrying mop buckets instead of textbooks. As Richard finished reciting his impossible riddle, I closed my eyes and let the words arrange themselves in my memory. I could feel the silence stretching, could sense the anticipation building around that expensive table. In my mind, I began working through the logic, following each thread to its conclusion, testing each possibility against the constraints of the puzzle. And then I saw it. The answer. Clear as the crystal glasses reflecting candlelight, simple as breathing. "The answer is 7, I said quietly. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the expectant quiet of people waiting for entertainment. This was the stunned silence of a world shifting off its axis. Richard's face went through several shades of red before settling on a pale gray. That can't be right." "Would you like me to explain my reasoning, sir?" I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. One of the guests, a woman with diamonds that could pay off 3 mortgages, leaned forward. "Richard, is she correct?" He nodded slowly, the words seeming to stick in his throat. "Yes." The room exploded in whispers. $3 million. The maid had just won $3 million. But that's when I learned something about the truly wealthy, something that would change everything I thought I knew about power and money. When Richard said he'd give me $3 million, he was lying. Not intentionally, perhaps, but lying nonetheless. Because men like Richard Pemberton III don't become billionaires by honoring promises made to people they consider beneath them. "Of course," he said, his voice quickly regaining its usual authority. "I was speaking hypothetically. No one actually expected—" He laughed, but it sounded forced now, brittle. "I mean, $3 million? For solving a riddle? Surely you understand it was just dinner conversation." The guests around the table shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at their plates. Others found sudden interest in the artwork on the walls. No one met my eyes. And that's when I truly understood my place in their world. I wasn't a person who could win their games. I was a prop in their theater, meant to fail for their amusement. When I succeeded, I broke their script, and they simply rewrote it to put me back in my assigned role. That night, after the guests had gone home with their uncomfortable secrets, after I'd cleaned the last dish and swept the last crumb from marble floors, I sat in my small room, really just a converted office space with a twin bed and a shared bathroom down the hall. I stared at the ceiling and felt something crack inside me. Not break entirely, not yet. Just crack. Like the first stress line in glass before it shatters. You want to know what 15 years of invisible servitude teaches you. It teaches you to swallow humiliation like bitter medicine. It teaches you to carry other people's secrets without letting them show on your face. It teaches you that your worth is measured not in who you are, but in how well you anticipate what others need. I had raised Richard's children more than their own parents did. While he was busy managing his investment portfolio and she was managing her social calendar, I was the one who sat up with sick babies, who helped with homework, who kissed scraped knees and wiped away tears. I was the one who remembered birthdays, who made sure school permission slips were signed, who drove to parent-teacher conferences when the actual parents were too busy with million-dollar business deals. There was Jonathan, the oldest, now 25 and working at his father's hedge fund. He'd learned to play chess on my lap when he was 6, practicing his moves against me during long afternoons when his parents were away. I'd taught him basic Spanish while we baked cookies together, helped him through his first heartbreak at 14. But when he looked at me now, I saw only polite distance. The careful courtesy reserved for hired help. And Sarah, 22, fresh out of Columbia with a degree in art history that her father's connections had made possible. She'd been my shadow once, following me through the penthouse, chattering about her dreams while I folded laundry and prepared meals. I'd been the one to hold her when nightmares woke her in the middle of the night, the one who listened to her teenage confessions about boys and friends and fears about the future. Now she spoke to me in the same clipped tones her mother used, requesting rather than asking, expecting rather than hoping. The youngest, Michael, was 17 and barely acknowledged my existence, except when he needed something. A snack prepared, a room cleaned, a mess handled discreetly. I'd potty trained this boy, taught him to tie his shoes, helped him build elaborate Lego castles that took over entire rooms. But adolescence had taught him that caring about the help wasn't sophisticated, wasn't appropriate for someone of his social standing. I'd been at their family vacations, not as a guest, but as staff, responsible for keeping routines intact while they enjoyed themselves. I'd packed their suitcases, unpacked their suitcases, made sure medications were taken and dietary restrictions observed. I'd been in family photos, not in them, but behind the camera, capturing their memories while creating none of my own. And through all this, I'd sent money home to my own daughter, Isabella, who was now 28 and working as a nurse in the Bronx. Money that should have bought me small luxuries, small dignities, instead went toward her student loans, her rent, her life. She was proud of her work, proud of helping people, and I was proud of her. But there was always a shadow over our relationship, the knowledge that I'd chosen someone else's family over hers, that I'd been more present for children whose parents paid my salary than for the child who carried my blood. The morning after the Riddle incident, I woke to find an envelope slipped under my door. My monthly salary paid early, a gesture I might have once interpreted as kindness, but now understood as guilt. Or perhaps as a reminder of our relationship's true nature. They paid me, I provided services. Everything else was sentiment, easily discarded when inconvenient. But money, I was learning, meant different things to different people. To Richard and his wife Catherine, money was power, status. The ability to shape the world according to their desires. Their investment portfolios included tech stocks, real estate holdings, cryptocurrency accounts with Bitcoin fluctuating in value by thousands of dollars daily. They spoke casually about millions, about market volatility, about diversifying assets across international markets. Money was abstract to them, numbers on statements managed by teams of professional advisors. To me, money was concrete. It was groceries and rent and the electric bill. It was choosing between a winter coat for myself or helping Isabella with her car payment. It was the difference between dignity and desperation, between independence and servitude. The days following the dinner party were different. I sensed it in the way conversations quieted when I entered rooms, in the glances exchanged between family members, in the subtle shift of atmosphere that told me I had crossed some invisible line. I had violated the natural order by being clever when I was supposed to be simple, by succeeding when I was expected to fail. Catherine began finding faults that hadn't existed before. The glass surfaces weren't clean enough. The towels weren't folded properly. The meals I prepared, the same meals I'd been making for years, were suddenly too salty, too bland, too something. Each criticism was delivered with a smile, but the smile never reached her eyes. "I know you're doing your best, Maria," she'd say, examining a perfectly clean bathroom with theatrical scrutiny. "Perhaps you're just getting a bit distracted lately. I understand that can happen as we age." Richard's approach was more direct. And he began timing my work, appearing suddenly in rooms where I was cleaning with questions about my progress. "How much longer will you need in here, Maria? I have a conference call scheduled." As if the study he used twice a week belonged to him more than the space where I worked every day. The children, though I probably shouldn't call them children anymore, they were adults now, treated me with a new formality that hurt more than outright hostility. Jonathan no longer made casual conversation when our paths crossed. Sarah stopped asking my opinion about her outfit choices or weekend plans. Michael's requests became demands, delivered without eye contact or consideration. I began to understand that by solving Richard's riddle, I had committed an unforgivable sin. I had forgotten my place. In their world, help was supposed to be helpful, not intelligent, useful, not impressive. I was meant to facilitate their lives, not challenge their assumptions about intellectual superiority. But the real cruelty came in smaller moments, the kind of microaggressions that left no visible wounds but cut deep nonetheless. Richard's sister, Victoria, visited one afternoon and pulled Catherine aside for what she clearly thought was a private conversation. I was dusting nearby bookshelves, invisible as always, when I heard her stage whisper, "Are you sure you can trust her? She seems awfully calculating." You know how these women can be, working their way into families, learning secrets. The implication hit me like a physical blow. 15 years of faithful service, of protecting their privacy, of treating their home with more care than I'd ever been able to give my own apartment. And I was now seen as a potential threat, a calculating woman who might use their secrets against them. That night, lying in my small room, I replayed every interaction, every conversation, every moment when I might have overstepped bounds I hadn't even known existed. Had I been too familiar with the children when they were young, too comfortable in their space, too present in their lives? The answer, I realized, was yes. I had been all of those things, but I had been those things because that's what they'd wanted, what they'd needed, what they'd paid me to be. When Jonathan was 8 and had recurring nightmares about monsters under his bed, they'd been relieved to have me handle the middle-of-the-night comfort sessions. When Sarah was 13 and fighting with her parents about everything, they'd been grateful that she still talked to me, that I could mediate and explain and bridge the generational gap they couldn't cross themselves. I had been the woman who knew everyone's favorite foods, who remembered allergies and preferences and important dates. I had been the keeper of family routines, the one who made sure life ran smoothly behind the scenes. I had been, in many ways, more consistently present in their daily lives than either parent. And now I was being punished for that intimacy, for that knowledge, for the trust they had given me when it was convenient and were now reclaiming when it felt threatening. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. I was preparing lunch when Catherine entered the kitchen, her face set in the expression she wore for distasteful but necessary tasks. "Maria, we need to talk," she began, perching on the edge of a bar stool like she might need to make a quick escape. "Richard and I have been discussing our household needs, and we think it might be time for some changes." My hand stilled on the vegetables I was chopping. Here it comes, I thought. 15 years, and it ends like this. "We've decided to hire additional staff," she continued. "Someone to handle the heavier cleaning, perhaps a separate person for cooking. Your responsibilities would be more focused." What she meant, of course, was reduced. What she meant was that they were diluting my role, minimizing my importance, ensuring that no single employee would ever again know enough about their lives to make them feel vulnerable. Of course, this means your hours would be reduced as well, and your compensation would need to be adjusted accordingly. I set down the knife and turned to face her fully. How much of a reduction? She named a figure that was less than half my current salary. Not enough to live on, certainly not enough to continue helping Isabella with her student loans. Enough, perhaps, to keep me desperate enough to accept whatever scraps they offered. "I understand this is an adjustment," Catherine continued, her voice taking on the tone she used with charitable organizations that had disappointed her. "But we feel it's better for everyone involved. Less pressure on you, more specialized care for our home." I nodded slowly, understanding exactly what was happening. This was my punishment for solving the riddle, for being more than they'd wanted me to be. This was how they reasserted control, how they reminded me of my place in their hierarchy. "When would these changes take effect?" I asked. "Next month. That gives you time to adjust your expectations." Adjust my expectations. As if my expectations had ever been anything more than basic dignity, fair compensation, and simple human recognition. That afternoon, I walked through Central Park for the first time in 15 years, not hurrying to complete an errand, not rushing between tasks, but simply walking. The late February air was crisp, and the bare trees looked like delicate drawings against the gray sky. Families pushed strollers along the paths, joggers pounded past with determined strides, and elderly couples sat on benches feeding pigeons from paper bags. I realized I knew almost nothing about the city I'd lived in for so long. My world had shrunk to the penthouse, the grocery store where I shopped for their meals, the dry cleaner where I took their clothes, the bank where I deposited my paychecks and immediately transferred portions to Isabella's account. I sat on a bench near the reservoir and watched people live their lives. A young mother was teaching her toddler to walk, celebrating each wobbling step with elaborate praise. An elderly man was reading a newspaper while eating a sandwich, occasionally sharing crumbs with hopeful pigeons. A group of teenagers was playing music and laughing, their joy infectious even at a distance. These people had problems, I'm sure. They had bills and disappointments and fears about the future. But they also had freedom. They belonged to themselves in ways I had forgotten were possible. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I began looking for another job. It wasn't easy. After 15 years of live-in domestic work, my resume was a single line: experience managing a large Manhattan household. I had no references except the family who was currently pushing me out. I had no permanent address except the room they had provided. I had no emergency fund except what little I'd managed to save, despite sending most of my earnings home. But I had something else, something I hadn't recognized until the riddle night forced me to remember. I had a mind that could solve complex problems, hands that could create order from chaos, and a heart that had learned to love without expecting love in return. Those skills, I told myself, had to be worth something to someone. I began my search quietly. Using the computer in the penthouse's home office during hours when the family was busy with their own lives, I applied for positions that offered more dignity: house manager roles, positions with smaller families who might value personal attention over institutional distance, even jobs outside domestic service entirely. The responses were sparse. Many positions wanted references from recent employers. Others paid significantly less than what I'd been making, even after Catherine's proposed cuts. Some required skills I didn't have: formal training in elder care, experience with smart home technology, fluency in languages I'd never had time to learn. But a few responses gave me hope. A family in Brooklyn Heights was looking for a live-out housekeeper, someone experienced but independent. A small hotel in Queens needed an executive housekeeper, someone who could manage staff and maintain standards without constant supervision. An elderly couple on the Upper West Side wanted a companion who could also handle light housekeeping, someone who could provide conversation as well as services. Each possibility represented a different kind of future, a different version of the person I might become. The Brooklyn position would let me have my own apartment for the first time in 15 years, a space that belonged to me rather than being provided at someone else's convenience. The hotel job would give me management experience, skills I could build on for future opportunities. The companion position would value my ability to connect with people, to provide comfort and understanding, rather than just practical services. As I prepared applications and crafted cover letters, I began to remember parts of myself that had been dormant for so long I'd almost forgotten they existed. The part of me that enjoyed solving puzzles and learning new things. The part that took pride in organizing systems and improving efficiency. The part that found satisfaction in work well done, recognized or not. But even as hope began to grow, reality reasserted itself daily. I still woke in the penthouse, still performed my duties under Catherine's increasingly critical eye, still sent money home to Isabella while my own future grew more uncertain. The new staff Catherine had mentioned began arriving in March. First came Elena, a young woman from Ecuador who would handle the heavy cleaning. She was eager, hard-working, and clearly intimidated by the luxury surrounding her. I recognized myself in her wide-eyed amazement at the marble surfaces, the crystal fixtures, the artwork worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. "How long have you worked here?" she asked in accented English during her first week. 15 years, I replied, and watched her face change. 15 years must have seemed impossible to her, an eternity of servitude. "Do you like it?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. "I liked parts of it," I said finally, "but it's time for something new." The cooking assistant came next, a culinary school graduate named Marcus, who brought energy and innovation to meal preparation. He had ideas about seasonal menus and presentation, suggestions for improving efficiency and reducing waste. Catherine loved his enthusiasm, his professional training, his fresh perspective. Watching her interact with Marcus, I saw how she'd probably treated me 15 years ago, with interest, appreciation, even warmth. I wasn't bitter about her preference for him. He deserved recognition for his skills, but it reminded me how quickly I'd become part of the furniture, noticed only when something went wrong. My own duties shrank daily. Elena handled the bathrooms and floors. Marcus managed meals and kitchen organization. I was left with laundry, light tidying, and whatever tasks no one else had time for. My presence in the penthouse became increasingly redundant, exactly as Catherine had planned. The family's treatment of me during this transition revealed everything about their character. Richard ignored me entirely, as if I'd already ceased to exist. Catherine maintained polite courtesy, but nothing more. Speaking to me only when necessary and then briefly. The children continued their studied indifference, perhaps relieved that my departure would eliminate any awkward reminders of their childhood dependence on help. Only once did anyone acknowledge the change directly. I was folding towels in the laundry room when Jonathan appeared, apparently looking for something he'd left in a coat pocket. "So you're leaving us," he said without preamble. "The family's needs are changing," I replied carefully. He nodded, though whether in agreement or acknowledgement, I couldn't tell. For a moment, I thought he might say something more, perhaps some reference to our shared history, some recognition of how I'd helped raise him, but he simply retrieved his item and left without another word. That was when I understood that my investment in their family had been entirely one-sided. I had loved them as if they were my own, had prioritized their needs above my own desires, had given 15 years of my life to ensuring their comfort and happiness. But to them, I had never been more than an employee, and not a particularly valued one. The realization hurt less than I'd expected. Perhaps I'd been preparing for it subconsciously for years, building emotional walls to protect myself from exactly this rejection. Or perhaps I was simply too tired for fresh heartbreak, too focused on survival to waste energy on disappointment. My job search intensified as my departure date approached. The Brooklyn family scheduled an interview, and I took a personal day, my first in over a year, to meet them. Their brownstone was elegant but comfortable. Clearly a home rather than a showplace. They asked about my experience, my expectations, my approach to household management. They seemed interested in me as a person, not just as a solution to their domestic needs. "We travel frequently for work," the wife explained, "and we need someone reliable but independent, someone who can handle emergencies, make decisions, keep things running smoothly whether we're here or not." It was exactly what I'd been doing for the Pemberton family, but somehow it sounded different coming from her. She was describing partnership rather than servitude, trust rather than oversight. The hotel interview went equally well. The manager appreciated my experience with high-end service, my attention to detail, my ability to train and supervise others. The position would require learning new systems, adapting to different routines, but it offered growth potential and professional respect. The companion job touched something deeper. Mrs. Chen was 87, her husband 89, and they'd been married for 63 years. Their apartment overlooked Riverside Park, filled with books and photographs and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. "We don't need someone to take care of us," Mrs. Chen explained over tea and homemade cookies. "We need someone to share our days, to help with tasks that have become difficult, to be present for conversation and companionship." She asked about my family, my interests, my dreams for the future. When I mentioned that I'd been studying mathematics before life intervened, she lit up. "I was a chemistry teacher for 40 years, she said. "I still love learning, still love sharing knowledge. Perhaps you could continue your education while you're working with us. There are wonderful programs for adult learners, and the schedule would be flexible." The possibility of returning to school, of picking up threads I'd dropped so long ago, sent a flutter of excitement through my chest. Could I really do it? Could I balance work and study, rebuild the life I'd set aside for others? 2 weeks before my scheduled departure from the penthouse, I received job offers from both the Brooklyn family and the hotel. The companion position required more discussion. Mrs. Chen wanted to make sure we were compatible before committing to what she hoped would be a long-term arrangement. But she invited me to spend a trial week with them. I had choices, real choices, based on what I wanted rather than what others needed from me. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. Catherine seemed surprised when I gave my 2 weeks' notice. "I assumed you'd want to stay on in your reduced capacity," she said, as if offering me half a job at half the pay had been generous rather than insulting. "I've found other opportunities," I replied. "Opportunities that better match my skills and experience." For just a moment, I saw something like surprise in her eyes. Perhaps she'd expected me to accept whatever they offered, to be grateful for any scraps from their table. Perhaps she'd forgotten that I was a person with options, with dignity, with the ability to make choices about my own life. "Well," she said finally, "I hope it works out for you." It was the closest thing to a blessing I was likely to receive from her. My last days in the penthouse were strange, like living in a house that was already haunting itself. I packed my few belongings, clothes that had grown shabby over years of service, books I'd bought but rarely had time to read, photographs of Isabella at various ages. Everything I owned fit easily into 2 suitcases, a stark reminder of how little space I'd claimed for myself in 15 years. Elena and Marcus were settling into their roles, each bringing their own approaches to tasks I'd performed for so long they felt like muscle memory. I trained them on family preferences, household routines, the small details that made life run smoothly for people accustomed to seamless service. "They seem nice," Elena said hopefully as we worked together one afternoon. "They can be," I replied honestly. "Just remember that this is their home, not yours. Don't make my mistake of forgetting the difference." She looked confused, and I didn't elaborate. She would learn, as I had learned, the boundaries that governed relationships between employees and employers. Perhaps she would be smarter about maintaining them. On my last evening, I walked through the penthouse one final time, not sentimentally but practically, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything, ensuring that nothing was left undone. The rooms were as beautiful as ever, as perfectly maintained, as empty of real warmth. Tomorrow, someone else would be responsible for their care, and I would begin building a life that belonged to me. I felt no sadness leaving that beautiful prison, but I did feel something like grief for the person I'd been when I'd first arrived. That young woman, devastated by her husband's abandonment, desperate for security, willing to trade almost anything for the promise of stability. She had survived, had evolved, had finally remembered her own worth, but she had paid a price that no paycheck could ever reimburse. The next morning, Richard was already at his office when I left my keys on the kitchen counter and walked out of the penthouse for the last time. Catherine was at her yoga class. The children were at their own jobs, their own lives. No one marked my departure except the doorman, who wished me well and asked if I needed help with my suitcases. I chose the companion position with Mr. and Mrs. Chen. Something about their warmth, their genuine interest in me as a person, their offer to support my educational goals, felt like a gift after so many years of transactional relationships. Their apartment became my sanctuary. Yes, I cleaned and cooked and helped with daily tasks, but I also played chess with Mr. Chen and discussed books with Mrs. Chen. I enrolled in evening classes at Hunter College, returning to mathematics after a 28-year absence. My professors were encouraging, my classmates welcoming, my own capacity for learning surprisingly intact despite the long dormancy. For the first time in decades, I was building something for myself. Knowledge that no one could take away, skills that would grow rather than diminish with time, a future that extended beyond other people's needs. But the story doesn't end there. Because 6 months after I left the penthouse, I received an email that changed everything I thought I knew about power, justice, and the price of humiliation. The email came from someone I'd never expected to hear from, Marcus, the young chef who had replaced me in the kitchen. His message was brief but urgent. "Miss Santos, I need to speak with you about something I found in Mr. Pemberton's study. It's important. Can we meet?" We met at a small cafe in Queens, away from Manhattan's prying eyes. Marcus looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. "I found something," he said without preamble, sliding a folder across the table. I was cleaning Mr. Pemberton's study. He spilled wine on some papers, and I saw financial documents that didn't look right. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were bank statements, investment records, cryptocurrency transaction logs, and correspondence with offshore account managers. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars flowing through accounts that didn't appear on any official records, profits from stock trades that seemed impossibly consistent, Bitcoin transfers to untraceable wallets. "I think he's been running some kind of tax evasion scheme," Marcus whispered. "Look at these dates. They correspond with major market movements, but his profits never show losses. It's like he has inside information." My mind, sharpened by months of mathematical study, quickly grasped the implications. Richard hadn't built his fortune entirely through legitimate investments. He'd been using insider trading, tax havens, and cryptocurrency manipulation to multiply his wealth while avoiding his legal obligations. The family's lifestyle, their casual attitude toward money, their sense of superiority, all built on fraud. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Marcus looked uncomfortable. "Because of what happened with the riddle. Elena told me about it, how they treated you after you solved it. It wasn't right. And then I found these papers, and I remembered how he laughed at you, how he called you simple." His voice grew stronger. "You deserved better. They all deserved to face consequences." I stared at the documents, understanding that Marcus was offering me something precious, the chance for justice, for vindication, for revenge against people who had dismissed my intelligence and discarded my loyalty. But revenge, I'd learned, was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had a new life now, new possibilities, a future that didn't depend on the past's pain. Getting involved in exposing Richard's crimes would mean investigations, legal proceedings, media attention, all things that would disrupt the peaceful existence I'd finally achieved. "What are you going to do with this information?" I asked Marcus. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm not sure who to trust, who would believe me, but I couldn't just ignore it." I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "You should take this to the FBI," I said quietly. "Financial Crimes Division. They have procedures for protecting whistleblowers, resources for investigating complex fraud cases. What about you? Don't you want to be involved?" I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. "I want to go home to my textbooks and help Mrs. Chen with her crossword puzzle. I want to continue building a life that has nothing to do with the Pemberton family." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding. He took the folder and slipped it back into his jacket. "They were lucky to have you," he said. "They just didn't know it." 6 months later, Richard Pemberton III was indicted on 17 counts of securities fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The investigation revealed a complex scheme involving insider trading, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency manipulation that had netted him over $50 million in illegal profits. His assets were frozen, his penthouse seized, his reputation destroyed. I read about it in the newspaper while drinking morning coffee with the Chens, feeling nothing more than mild interest, like reading about events in a distant country. That part of my life was over, as completely finished as if it had happened to someone else. "Terrible thing," Mrs. Chen commented, reading over my shoulder. "All that money, all that privilege, and he threw it away for greed." "Some people are never satisfied with enough," her husband added. "They always need more. More money, more power, more control over others." I thought about the riddle that night, about the moment when Richard had offered me $3 million with such casual cruelty. He'd been playing with money that wasn't even legitimately his, offering from a fortune built on lies and theft. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so perfectly representative of his character. But the real satisfaction came not from his downfall, but from my rise. I completed my mathematics degree 2 years later, graduating summa cum laude at 55. Mrs. Chen and her husband attended the ceremony, cheering louder than any family member when I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. I began tutoring other adult learners, helping people like myself who had delayed education for family obligations or financial necessity. The work was rewarding in ways that domestic service had never been, not because cleaning and cooking were somehow lesser, but because teaching recognized my mind as well as my hands, my thoughts, as well as my labor. The Chens became my chosen family, people who valued my presence rather than just my services. When Mr. Chen died peacefully in his sleep at 93, I held Mrs. Chen's hand through her grief and helped her navigate the practical details of widowhood. When she decided to move to a retirement community 2 years later, she asked me to help her choose one, to visit regularly, to remain part of her life not as an employee, but as a friend. I rented a small apartment in Astoria, Queens, my first independent home since my marriage ended 30 years earlier. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. I chose the curtains, painted the walls, colors I loved, filled the bookshelves with texts on mathematics, literature, and philosophy. I planted herbs on the fire escape and adopted a cat from the local shelter. I built a life that reflected my own choices rather than other people's needs. Isabella and I grew closer as my circumstances improved. She visited my apartment regularly, bringing her own children, my grandchildren, who knew me not as someone who worked for other families, but as their grandmother who helped them with homework and taught them to bake cookies. They were proud of my college graduation, impressed by my tutoring work, matter-of-fact about my intelligence in ways that their mother had never been allowed to be. Sometimes, walking through Manhattan, I would pass the building where the Pemberton penthouse had been. Usually, I felt nothing more than mild curiosity about who lived there now. But occasionally, I would remember specific moments, Jonathan's small hand in mine as we crossed busy streets, Sarah's excited chatter about school friends, Michael's proud smile when he mastered some small skill. Those children had become adults who couldn't acknowledge our shared history, but I'd still been part of their growing up. That had value, regardless of how it ended. The Riddle incident, which had once seemed like the defining humiliation of my service, eventually became just another data point in understanding the family's character. Richard's cruelty that night hadn't been about intelligence or problem-solving. It had been about power, about reinforcing hierarchies he needed to maintain for his own psychological comfort. My ability to solve his puzzle had threatened his worldview, and he'd responded with the tools available to him: dismissal, belittlement, economic pressure. But I'd learned something important that night, something that took years to fully understand. Intelligence without opportunity means nothing. Talent without recognition changes nothing. Dignity without independence is just performance. The real riddle hadn't been Richard's logic puzzle. The real riddle had been this: how does a woman reclaim her life after spending decades serving others? How does she rebuild identity, pursue dreams, and create meaning when the world has taught her that her value lies only in her usefulness to others? The answer, I discovered, was patience, courage, and the willingness to disappoint people who had never truly seen her anyway. Now, at 58, I wake each morning in my own bed, in my own apartment, responsible to no one but myself and the students who depend on me for guidance. I drink coffee from mugs I chose, read books that interest me, spend time with people who value my thoughts as much as my services. The woman who solved Richard Pemberton's riddle had been buried under years of servitude, silenced by financial necessity, dismissed by people who confused wealth with worth. But she'd never really disappeared. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to resurface, for circumstances that would allow her intelligence to flourish rather than threaten others. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Richard had actually honored his promise that night, if he'd written me a check for $3 million and watched me walk away wealthy. Would I have been satisfied with money alone? Would I have continued building the life I'd eventually created, or would I have been content to simply be comfortable? I think I know the answer. Money without respect is just another form of charity. Wealth without recognition is just gilded servitude. What I'd needed wasn't his $3 million, it was the opportunity to prove my worth to myself, to build something that couldn't be taken away by other people's whims or cruelties. The riddle had been solved the moment I understood that I didn't need Richard Pemberton's validation or his money. I needed my own education, my own choices, my own life built on foundations that no one else could shake. That realization, more than any financial windfall, had set me free. But the story of that riddle, of that humiliation that became a catalyst for transformation, didn't end with my graduation or even with Richard's downfall. It continued to ripple through my life in ways I never expected, creating connections and opportunities that proved how interconnected our world really is. 3 years into my new career as a mathematics tutor, I received a call from Dr. Patricia Williams, the Dean of Continuing Education at Hunter College. She'd heard about my work with adult learners, my particular gift for helping people who'd been away from formal education for years or decades. "We're developing a new program," she explained during our meeting in her office overlooking the campus where I'd once been a struggling young mother trying to balance textbooks and diapers. "It's designed for domestic workers who want to pursue higher education, housekeepers, nannies, caregivers who've put their own dreams on hold to support others. The program would offer evening and weekend classes, flexible scheduling, childcare support, and financial aid, specifically targeted at women in service occupations. They wanted me to help design the curriculum, to serve as both instructor and counselor, to bridge the gap between academic theory and real-world experience." "You understand their challenges," Dr. Williams said. "You've lived their struggles. You know what it takes to rebuild a life from the ground up." I accepted the position immediately. Here was a chance to transform that long-ago humiliation into something meaningful, to ensure that other women wouldn't have to wait until their 50s to discover their own intellectual worth. The program launched with 27 students, women ranging in age from 25 to 62. They were nannies and housekeepers, home health aides and elder care companions. They were immigrants and native-born Americans, high school dropouts and community college graduates. What they shared was the experience of taking care of everyone except themselves, of prioritizing others' needs while their own dreams gathered dust. I taught them mathematics, yes, but I also taught them something more precious, that intelligence comes in many forms, that wisdom earned through service has value, that it's never too late to change the story you tell about your own life. Maria Gonzalez was 43, working as a live-in nanny for a family in Westchester while supporting 3 children of her own in the Bronx. She'd always loved numbers, had dreamed of becoming an accountant, but pregnancy at 17 had derailed those plans. Now her youngest was finally in high school, and she was ready to reclaim that dream. "I solved the family's financial software crisis last month," she told me during one of our one-on-one sessions. "The father couldn't figure out why their budget numbers weren't adding up, and I found the error in about 10 minutes. But when he thanked me, he seemed surprised, like he'd never noticed I was good with numbers." I saw myself in her frustration, in that familiar experience of having your intelligence overlooked by people who'd hired you for your hands, not your mind. "What he noticed or didn't notice doesn't matter," I told her. "What matters is what you know about yourself. Can you solve complex problems? Can you see patterns others miss? Can you learn new systems quickly?" She nodded to each question. "Then you're ready for the next level. His recognition would be nice, but it's not necessary." There was Rosa Martinez, 51, who'd been cleaning offices at night while raising 4 children alone. She'd always been fascinated by science, had conducted elaborate experiments with her kids, using kitchen supplies and library books. When she finally had time to pursue formal education, she worried she was too old, too rusty, too far removed from academic thinking. "I haven't been in a classroom in over 30 years, she confided. "What if I can't keep up? What if the younger students think I don't belong?" I shared with Rosa something I'd learned during my own return to college, that life experience is its own education, that the skills we develop through service, observation, problem-solving, patience, attention to detail, are exactly what success in higher education requires. "You've been conducting research every night for years," I pointed out. "Every time you figured out the most efficient way to clean a building, every time you solved a maintenance problem nobody else could fix, every time you organized systems to save time and improve results. You just weren't calling it research." And there was Jennifer Kim, 28, who'd been working as a companion to an elderly woman with Alzheimer's. She'd developed techniques for communication and comfort that impressed the family's doctors, but she'd never considered herself smart enough for formal healthcare training. "I know I help Mrs. Patterson," she said. "I can usually calm her when she's agitated, and I've figured out ways to help her remember important things. But that's just common sense, isn't it?" "No," I told her firmly. "That's specialized knowledge. That's skill developed through observation and practice. That's exactly the kind of intelligence that healthcare programs are looking for." Working with these women, I began to understand how systematic the dismissal of domestic workers' intelligence really was. They weren't just undervalued economically. They were systematically trained to undervalue their own minds. They were praised for being good with their hands, while their problem-solving abilities went unrecognized. They were appreciated for their reliability, while their innovative thinking was invisible. But they were incredibly smart. They had to be. Managing a household requires project management skills. Caring for children demands psychology and education expertise. Elder care involves medical knowledge and emotional intelligence. Cleaning efficiently requires understanding of chemistry and physics. Cooking for a family means nutrition science and logistics planning. Yet because this intelligence was deployed in service of others, in environments where their employers preferred not to think of them as intellectual equals, it remained hidden even from the women themselves. The mathematics I taught them was almost secondary to the confidence building. Yes, they needed algebra and statistics and basic calculus to pursue their dreams in accounting, nursing, business management, or education. But more importantly, they needed to believe they deserved those dreams, that their minds were worth developing, that their potential was unlimited regardless of how long it had been suppressed. The program's first graduating class included 15 women who'd completed associate degrees while continuing their jobs. Maria became a certified public accountant and started her own practice specializing in small businesses owned by immigrants. Rosa earned her nursing degree and now works in pediatric oncology, bringing the same nurturing skills to sick children that she'd once devoted to her employers' families. Jennifer completed a master's in social work and established a support program for families dealing with dementia. Each success story felt like vindication, proof that intelligence had never been the real barrier. The barriers had been opportunity, encouragement, and simple recognition that minds capable of managing complex households and caring for vulnerable people were also capable of academic achievement. But perhaps the most rewarding moment came during the program's third year, when I received an unexpected visitor. Elena, the young woman who'd replaced me at the Pemberton household, appeared at my office one afternoon, nervous but determined. "Ms. Santos," she said, "I've been thinking about what you told me the day you left, about not forgetting the difference between their home and yours." I invited her to sit, curious about what had brought her to my door after 3 years. "I love the work," she continued. "The family treats me well, pays me fairly. But I've been watching how they talk about their investments, their business deals, and I realize I understand more than they think I do." Elena had been quietly developing her own investment knowledge, using free online courses and library books to learn about stocks, bonds, and cryptocurrency. She'd been tracking the market, making theoretical trades on paper, and discovering that she had an intuitive grasp of financial patterns. "I want to go to school," she said. "I want to learn finance properly, maybe work as a financial advisor someday, but I'm scared. What if I'm not smart enough? What if I'm just fooling myself?" I saw myself at her age, felt that same mixture of ambition and terror, that same doubt about whether dreams were realistic or merely wishful thinking. But I also saw something else, the beginning of her own transformation, her own recognition that service work and intellectual aspirations weren't mutually exclusive. "Elena," I said, "you're already doing the work. You're already learning, already proving to yourself that you can understand complex financial concepts. The only question is whether you're ready to make it official." She enrolled in the program that fall, continuing her position with the Pemberton family while pursuing an associate degree in business. Catherine initially seemed puzzled by this development. Why would the help want to study finance? but eventually became supportive, even proud in an odd way, as if Elena's ambition reflected well on the household's enlightened attitude towards staff development. What Catherine didn't know was that Elena had learned from my experience. She maintained clear boundaries, never forgot that she was an employee rather than a family member, and kept her educational goals separate from her work responsibilities. She was cordial but not intimate, professional but not personal. "I watched what happened to you," Elena told me during one of our weekly tutoring sessions, "how they turned on you after the Riddle incident. I won't make the same mistake of thinking they see me as anything more than useful." Her emotional distance protected her in ways my emotional investment had not. When she graduated with honors and announced her intention to leave domestic service for a position with a financial planning firm, the family congratulated her politely and began looking for a replacement. There was no drama, no punishment, no attempt to undermine her transition. She was simply an employee who'd found better employment elsewhere. The contrast with my own departure was stark but illuminating. Elena had never tried to be part of the family, had never confused professional service with personal relationship. As a result, her departure was a business transaction rather than a betrayal of intimacy. "Did you ever regret it?" she asked during our last session before her transition to the financial firm. "All those years you spent taking care of them, only to have them dismiss you when it was convenient." I considered the question carefully. "I regret staying too long," I said finally. "I regret believing that loyalty would be reciprocated, that service would earn respect rather than just expectation. But I don't regret the experience entirely. It taught me things about myself, about resilience, about finding dignity in difficult circumstances, and it led me here, to this work, to the chance to help women like you and me recognize our own worth." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's the real answer to Mr. Pemberton's riddle," she said. "Not the number 7, but learning how to value yourself when other people won't." Her insight stayed with me long after she left for her new career. Perhaps that had been the deeper riddle all along, not the logic puzzle that Richard had posed to humiliate me, but the life puzzle of defining your worth independent of other people's recognition. The mathematics program continued to grow, eventually expanding to serve over 100 women annually. We added partnerships with community colleges, scholarship programs, and career placement services. The success stories multiplied. Women who'd spent years caring for other people's children became teachers and social workers. Women who'd managed other people's households became business owners and administrators. Women who'd provided elder care became nurses and healthcare advocates. Each graduate represented not just individual achievement, but systematic change, proof that intelligence had never been scarce among domestic workers. Only opportunity had been scarce. The media attention that followed the program's success eventually brought me back into contact with the world I'd left behind. Magazines wanted to write about the former maid who became a college professor. Television producers pitched stories about remarkable transformations and unexpected intelligence. I agreed to some interviews, carefully framed around the program's work rather than my personal history. But I always insisted that my story wasn't remarkable. What was remarkable was how many intelligent women had been overlooked, how much talent had been wasted, how many dreams had been deferred by economic necessity and social expectation. During one television appearance, the interviewer asked about the Riddle incident that had started everything. "Do you ever feel vindicated now?" she asked, "knowing that the man who mocked your intelligence ended up in prison while you've achieved professional success?" The question irritated me, though I tried not to let it show. It revealed the same shallow thinking that had characterized Richard's original cruelty, the idea that intelligence was competitive rather than collaborative, that one person's success required another's failure. "I don't think about Richard Pemberton anymore," I replied honestly. "His fate had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with character. My success isn't vindication, It's just the natural result of finally getting opportunities to match my abilities. But privately, I did sometimes think about that dinner party. About the moment when Richard had offered $3 million with such casual certainty that I'd fail. Not because I wanted revenge or vindication, but because it represented something larger about how society approaches human potential. Richard had been wrong about my intelligence, but his mistake hadn't been personal. It had been systematic. He'd looked at me and seen only my job title, my economic status, my position in his social hierarchy. He'd been unable to imagine that the woman who cleaned his floors might also be capable of complex reasoning, that intelligence existed independently of opportunity to display it. His offer of $3 million had been cruel theater, designed to demonstrate truths he'd already assumed rather than discover truths he didn't know. He'd expected me to fail because failure would confirm his worldview, would maintain the comfortable boundaries between employer and employee, between valued and valuable people. But here's what I'd learned in the decades since leaving his penthouse. The riddle was never really about me. It was about him, about his need to feel superior, about his inability to see worth in people whose circumstances differed from his own. And the deeper riddle, the one about rebuilding a life, about recognizing your own value, about transforming service into empowerment, that riddle had required years to solve, not minutes. It had demanded patience, courage, education, and the support of people who saw potential where others saw only function. As I approached my 60th birthday, reflecting on the unexpected turns my life had taken, I realized that the answer to Richard's original riddle, the number 7, had been far less important than my willingness to attempt it. In that moment of standing before his dinner guests, vulnerable and challenged, I'd chosen to engage my mind rather than accept limitations others had placed on it. That choice, more than the correct answer, had started everything that followed. Today, when I work with new students in the program, I often share that story, not as inspiration, but as illustration of a simple truth. Intelligence emerges when it's given space to exist. Respect grows when it's modeled rather than demanded. Dignity develops when it's practiced rather than granted. The riddle of rebuilding a life, of recognizing worth, of transforming circumstances, that's a puzzle worth solving, regardless of how long it takes or who notices the solution. And unlike Richard Pemberton's $3 million promise, the rewards of solving it are real, lasting, and impossible for others to revoke. If you've ever worked for people who made you feel invisible, or if you've ever had your intelligence questioned by those who should have known better, I want you to know something. Your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition. Your value doesn't decrease because someone else fails to see it. Your dreams don't expire because life forced you to postpone them. It's never too late to solve the riddle of your own life, to prove to yourself that you're more than other people's limited expectations. The solution isn't always money or revenge or external validation. Sometimes it's simply the courage to walk away from situations that diminish you and toward opportunities that allow you to grow. What riddle are you ready to solve in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps this message reach other women who work with dedication and deserve recognition for their intelligence and strength. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving. You can find it by clicking on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. I'll see you in the next story.